It seems like, for the last several years, every week has been Infrastructure Week. With threats like hurricanes and droughts ever looming, growing risks to our infrastructural systems are apparent. Today, we're talking about these threats, where our greatest vulnerabilities are, and some of the things we should be doing to reinforce infrastructural weaknesses. Later in the hour, we'll also discuss the recent flaring events that have been in the news alongside the ship channel. I'm Weston Twardowski, an instructor in and associate director of Rice University's Center for Environmental Studies and the associate director of Eco Studio in Rice's Sustainability Institute. And you're listening to Gulf Streams on KPFT Houston 90.1 FM, Galveston 89.5 FM, and Huntsville 89.7 FM, where we talk with leading experts and community leaders to better understand the environmental problems and potential solutions facing our community. A quick reminder that you can catch up on Gulf Streams anytime through our podcast, available on all major podcast platforms. If you enjoy the show, please like and subscribe to make sure you never miss an episode. Before we jump into our conversation, I want to remind you that KPFT Houston is currently in our summer fund drive. As public radio, KPFT Houston can only exist with your support. Over 90% of our funding comes from listeners like you. If you're enjoying Gulf Streams and want to support our work, please call 713-526-KPFT and pledge a donation. You can make a one-time donation or become a monthly sustainer to support our work. In the coming weeks, Gulf Streams will feature conversations with experts on the economics of climate change, climate fiction, and the history of oil and gas. If you want to become a station sustainer, ask about our memory bricks, permanent inscribed tributes to your generosity here at the studio. Call 713-526-KPFT to learn about all the unique pledge drive offerings going on this month. We're delighted to bring you important conversations about environmental and climate issues here in Houston and beyond on Gulf Streams, and can only do so with your support. So please, call 713-526-KPFT, make a one-time or sustainer donation, mention Gulf Streams, and help us keep ad-free public radio on the air here in Houston. Today we're talking with Dr. Jamie Padgett, who is a professor of engineering in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering at Rice University. Dr. Padgett is an expert in all things infrastructure, where she considers multiple risks, including earthquakes, hurricanes, and aging and deterioration in our infrastructural systems. She's the author of over 200 articles in journals and archived conference proceedings, and is an expert in multiple kinds of risk and life cycle assessment. Dr. Padgett, welcome to the program.
Thank you. Happy to be here, Weston.
Jamie, just to start us off, can you tell us a little bit about your work and your background and how you came into what you do in research now?
Yeah, well, I'm a civil structural engineer by training, but I work in this space that's often referred to as risk and resilience modeling. So we take our knowledge of how structures perform, especially under extreme loads like those you'd see in hurricanes or earthquakes or flood events, and look at how we can predict their performance or their reliability under these extreme events. But it's become a really fun interdisciplinary field because we look at structures and infrastructure not just as these isolated systems like a bridge or a building, but how they more broadly serve community functions. And so that opens up really interesting questions about how failure of these systems impact communities and society, and how some of the decisions that we might make on improved design or risk mitigation have these cascading consequences.
Well, and that also feels like a really urgent field right now in the world as we continue to go through, all kinds of climate related disasters and that are just getting more intense. And so I'm wondering, what are maybe some of the broad things that you're thinking about here, specifically to your research? Because I know you're really invested in a lot of things that really impact the kind of Gulf Coast and Houston area in particular, which our listeners will be really interested in. But I also know that your research expands beyond that. So maybe you can walk us through a little bit some of the main things that you focus on.
Yeah. So we work in this space of what I'll call multi-hazard reliability, and that can be concurrent events. For example, a hurricane that strikes the Gulf Coast brings with it wind and storm surge and waves and rainfall all at the same time. But it also can be this notion of repeat events or subsequent events. So perhaps a classic example being Puerto Rico, struck by Hurricane Maria. A few years later, there was an earthquake series that also affected the same region. So these issues of the multiple stressors or multiple threats that our built environment faces are what we often look at. You pointed to the Gulf Coast in particular, given this listener pool. That really is something that I've particularly appreciated about this work, is the chance to do research that might hopefully have some impact right here in our backyard and is really relevant for some of the conversations about how do we better protect our communities when faced with these climate-related stressors. We do a lot of work in my group looking at kind of energy and industrial infrastructure, things like tanks, refineries, ports, as well as transportation infrastructure. So our bridge and roadway systems that are really crucial for access to, say, critical facilities during these hazards. So that a lot of times we look at Gulf Coast infrastructure as some of the test cases, not only that to make sure we're building models that can apply to real world systems, but hopefully help to answer some pressing questions down the line as well.
Well, and as you were saying, these kind of multiple compounding threats, right? Like I can imagine, here on the Gulf Coast, if we take examples, say in Houston or other places that we might think of along maybe the Louisiana coast that folks are maybe familiar with, I think it's very apparent, right, that certainly summer comes and we're in a heat wave, and we saw, just a couple of years ago, a prolonged drought, and that had all kinds of infrastructural impacts that actually I think people started really talking about after the derecho and after Hurricane Beryl, because it had been a minute since we'd had severe wind events in Houston. We'd gotten very accustomed to talking about hurricanes and flooding and had forgotten kind of the other end of that hurricane spectrum is the wind damage. And so, can you walk us through a little bit how these things are related, and exactly what are some of those overlapping, interrelated risks that we experience on the Gulf Coast?
Yeah, I think the challenge is that sometimes our memory is short and we might focus on that most apparent stressor that we just experienced.
Mm,
But I think just about anywhere you live in the country, but certainly in the Gulf Coast, you have the potential risk of these multiple, both interacting as well as subsequent events. And you mentioned some interesting cases that perhaps our exposure to them might even change, especially as we look to the future with a changing climate. So it's not only the intensity or frequency of our severe storms like our hurricanes, but there's a lot of talk about things like flooding that may occur just in your, flash flood, regular drive commute home,
mhm.
or picking up your kids from school. And it doesn't have to be that huge Gulf Coast storm that prompts some of these issues. And there's a lot of interaction when we have things like some of the heat related events or drought, for example. When we have things like aging deterioration of infrastructure that compounds these natural hazards, then we're putting our infrastructure in this initial condition that may make it more susceptible to damage when we have the punctuated hazards. That's been something that I think our group has been pretty interested in and trying to lead the conversation, is this idea of time evolving or time dependent vulnerability. So classically, when we model and predict the likelihood of failure of our structures and infrastructure, we think of it in its kind of perfect, pristine condition, the way it was designed and meant to be out in the field. And then we consider its exposure to, say, a hurricane event, a wind or surge or wave event. But the reality in the field is that our infrastructure is deteriorating. And it's this combination of those cyclic climate related stressors, but also the demands that we pose on our infrastructure. And in some cases, a lack of maintenance or pushing these systems beyond their initial life cycle. So a lot of interactions that don't just have to be in the hazard state. It could also be with respect to the infrastructure condition as well.
Well, and that's something I'd love to hear you talk more about is just what is the the kind of the status of our infrastructure maybe more broadly, especially in the Gulf Coast. I mean, it's certainly, there's the old joke that every week is infrastructure week in Washington. So, we know that people are always thinking about infrastructure. I think people are probably familiar with, scorecards that come out periodically, and we hear, oh, American infrastructure is not doing so great. But it seems like something we really only talk about when we encounter a kind of catastrophic failure. Sometimes that are really a direct result of oil, of exactly what you're saying, not cared for infrastructure, aging infrastructure. Sometimes it's things outside of people's control, like a boat hitting something, a bridge. I mean, that's really a different kind of topic. But I think, those are the moments that people tend to really direct attention to these questions. And, I can imagine, yeah, places like Houston, like Charles, where there's a bridge that seems to be the poster child of old bridges that really need to be redone. We can imagine, as you were discussing, yeah, these energy holding facilities and tanks, how well maintained are these things? It's a part of infrastructure we maybe don't immediately jump to thinking about. I think we think about roads and bridges a lot and not so much these other forms that are existing. But, along the ship channel, there's a whole lot of refinery structure. There's a whole lot of port structure that, yeah, especially after Hurricane Ike, folks were really talking about as a major source of risk if there were a major storm surge. So maybe maybe a two-part question here of kind of a broadly like, what is the state of our infrastructure and what should we be thinking about? And then more specifically, yeah, what are some of these risks you're really thinking about around our local infrastructures and energy in particular?
Yeah. So, I think the broader question about the state of our infrastructure it is a huge one. And I am excited to, hear of things like, large infrastructure investments that we truly hope to see, trickle down to local projects. There are efforts like our American Society of Civil Engineers, as you noted, released this report card. And it's a way to communicate and track the state of those systems. And, frankly, it may be something that people almost start to ignore because we keep hearing of our low rated systems. But I hope it's doing its purpose of prompting that conversation. I think one of the challenges is that may be important for kind of big picture discussion on policy and investment needs, but the real life decision making always comes back down to individual structures and systems. And so some of what we've been trying to do or work with some of our partners across the country to develop what we call open source resilience modeling
Mm.
environments. And so it's really, you can think of it as a software, but that can be contributed to by the broader research community and actually applied to real world systems and communities around the country in order to probe some of those questions, the what ifs. How would our combined, power, transportation, housing infrastructure fare in Galveston Island if there were this future storm event? And then play with what if questions. What if we were to have a pot of funds to invest in things like elevation, for example? And so I think these are really important because it takes that big picture message that like a report card presents, but then brings it down to hopefully a little more actionable information that can be used either to identify where to put investments or to have the backing, the information to ask for those resources and to justify that need at a local level. So that's one exciting development that I see. And I wanted to call out our NIST Center for Risk-Based Resilience Planning. So this is the NIST funded Center of Excellence, and we're coming out upon year 9, actually.
Wow, congrats.
And so it's been, a longstanding body of scientific work, but these last few years have really been focused on, well, how can we shift that to, more actionable, useful information and working with some communities to test that out. And so I hope that, moves forward even beyond this last final year of our NIST funding.
I'd love to ask you about that actually, because I think that's really significant. I think it's one of the things that both community organizations that we talk to a lot often struggle with is, yeah, how do we get a hold of scientific data? How do we make that accessible? How do we have access to this? And how do we sometimes even read it? Because we're not all, I'm not a trained civil engineer. And so I'm certain a great deal of the research that you've written, would be far outside of my scholarly expertise and just frankly out of my wheelhouse. And so, thinking about how do we bring the scientific data and all of the, really outstanding work that scientists are doing to think about these models and, local infrastructures and make that accessible to broader publics and also community groups who are really invested and local governments and other, kind of stakeholders who are really invested in these questions. And I'm wondering if you can talk maybe some about the work you've done there, but also strategies that you see for trying to build those partnerships and really disseminate that kind of research.
Yeah. I mean, it's an important question that I will say from a knowledge base is also not my training, my bread and butter, but as a community member, as a researcher in this field, I want to make sure that our work is useful and not just sitting on that shelf. So I would say my perspective is maybe less from a formal academic approach, but just saying, hey, what has been fun and what has potentially worked and what gives us excitement for the future.
I think that's
Um,
a lot of what we all wind up, nobody's usually trained in like, how do we bring this out to people beyond the academy? And so it's something that, yeah, that I think everyone is in the academy is trying to be more attentive to is how do we do that work?
I
Yeah.
think it's an important one. And some of the efforts, for example, I mentioned our NIST center, the last half of that center effort really has been taking what would otherwise be a very complex computational model, but working with colleagues at NCSA at the National Center for Supercomputing and putting a user interface, a community graphical user interface on that, and working with some of our colleagues through the center who do have that expertise in community planning and resilience planning and community engaged research. So it becomes a much more fun iterative process where I think it's, going to, for example, the city of Galveston and asking what are actually your pressing questions surrounding hazard resilience and what opportunities do you have to pursue funding and what information would you need? And that actually did, flip some of the emphases of the model development so that we were generating that useful and content and in the language that it needed to be presented so it could be actionable, say for funding requests. But I've seen, other, nice examples out there. I think we have colleagues right here at Rice and new centers at Rice that are working in this space, longitudinal connection, engagement with communities. That's really an authentic, genuine back and forth relationship. I would say the few projects examples that I've had the opportunity to be a part of that took that approach did indeed change my strategy as a researcher, as a scholar, and what we focused on. And I think it's a lot more rewarding that way too.
I agree. It's really rewarding work. It's time consuming work. It's one of the reasons it's tricky, exactly as you were saying, those longitudinal commitments, it's really thinking about you have to commit the time to work with these organizations. Has to be a different kind of dialogue, but it's really, really critical. And I think it's a conversation that science has been having for a while now. It's not totally new, but one that's been necessary and overdue. And I'm always excited to hear about the kind of ways that folks are going about trying to bridge this work. To a kind of slight jump, but I think relatedly, as you're thinking about some of these models and some of this, communicating information to publics, I think you had wanted to talk a little bit about a recent project that you guys have been doing that's a little more solutions focused, thinking more specifically around road conditions, which is maybe not the first thing we actually jump to when we think of like storm risk and things. But as you mentioned earlier, even moderate street flooding can be quite dangerous, as we know in Houston. So I'm wondering if you can talk both a little bit about what that research is, but yeah, some of the implications of yeah, how infrastructural research like this can lead to potential changes and adaptations for communities.
Yeah, so in that space, we have been working for quite a few years looking at flood impacts on infrastructure and specifically transportation infrastructure.
Mm.
The reason it came to the forefront for us is because if you look at the stats on fatalities during flood events, unfortunately, that is the number one cause of fatalities during flooding, or people driving into flooded and unsafe roadways.
Wow.
And we've even seen unfortunate cases right here in Houston and along the Gulf Coast. So our colleagues at the Speed Center at Rice, Phil Bedian's group and our Speed colleagues have been working in this space of flood alert systems for many years and partnering, for example, with Texas Medical Center or with the city of Houston. Um, but it gave us this exciting opportunity to build off of that system, which was more focused on radar rainfall data and flood modeling, and look at some of the impact side of that equation. And specifically, is there other information besides that we can use to inform our systems? They may not have been designed for flood situational awareness, meaning understanding the conditions that you're in, but we could leverage them. And especially, I think, in this new era of data science and leveraging machine learning or other types of intelligent algorithms, I think we have a huge opportunity there. So we've been working on looking at this situational awareness framework that could take information, for example, from traffic camera data. It wasn't intended to support flood alert or safe mobility during a storm, but we could leverage it for that purpose as well. Or reports even from citizens or from officials like TxDOT through Transtar, and just go and start to peruse all of the sources that we have in a modern city like Houston, and see how we can leverage and repurpose it for better understanding current flood conditions, especially on roadways, because of the importance of driver safety.
I'm curious now. I mean, that's, I think, yeah, understanding that is key. As much as turnaround, don't drown helps, it's probably not sufficient for really rethinking about how we can limit and prevent flooding. To that point, I would love to just get you to narrow down a little bit on Houston specifically as we start to head towards the end of this, and just think about what are, from your perspective, the largest kind of infrastructural risks that we're facing in Houston. We know we face myriad issues, and that's part of being a Houstonian. It's part of living on the Gulf Coast is facing hurricanes and heat and flooding and myriad other kind of factors. But what are some of the areas that you would really want us to direct attention to think about, here are structural weaknesses that we should really be clued into, whether they're things that maybe seem obvious or things that, yeah, are, more around just the way we've designed streets and in flooding, and thinking about educational campaigns or how we've, laid out the streets in particular ways. I'm curious if you would like to identify just a couple of things that maybe you think we really should be honed in on.
Yeah, I mean, I'm clearly biased because of our recent deep dive, but we worked with some great colleagues from the Kinder Institute here at Rice for Urban Studies, as well as from the sociology department, like Danielle King, and really went out to ask some of those questions. So, thinking of these extreme events, these hazards that we face in our infrastructure, what are some of those pressing issues? And some of these issues of safe mobility and supporting emergency response and operations. I think because of some of the public's experience with past events, that really shone bright as an area of interest. So that's kind of what drove us to this more user-centered or user inspired approach to looking at situational awareness during floods. So I think that one will be critical in at least the immediate term.
Yeah.
I think in the longer term, we really need to look at true investments in large scale solutions. We've had a lot of debate, public and private debate about investment in various coastal defense and protective systems. And I'm really not, I think, here to advocate for any one of those specific systems, but to say it's time to act. I think we can spin our wheels forever and maybe not have the perfect system, but if we design, develop, start to put in place different stages and an adaptable system that maybe we can continue to grow and improve on over time, we're making steps in the right direction. Houston's a really unique location, and so we have done a lot of studies in that ship channel region. And it's a really important convergence for different reasons. You know, one, we have a lot of potentially vulnerable assets with people living right in and around them, but also high of national and international importance as well in terms of some of the industries and commodities and throughput that come through this region. So it seems perhaps like an obvious case, like the obvious style location where we should be carefully looking at policy as well as carefully looking at how we can raise and invest funds for stronger protective systems in our region. So I hope that's something that we see moving forward. And if we were to have the same conversation in 10 years, we wouldn't still be wishing for major investment.
No, and I think we're going to be having a whole series of conversations around coastal resiliency and potential solutions on some of that front. So we'd love to have you back on at some point to talk a little more about some of those potential projects and what you think might really be effective there. Jamie Padgett, thank you so much for joining us today and for sharing your expertise. It's been delightful speaking with you.
Thank you, Weston. I appreciate the time today.
The next thing we'll be discussing is the recent series of flaring incidents that have been going on along the Houston Ship Channel. Flaring is where gas refineries will burn off excess natural gas, usually to prevent overpressure in certain parts of the refinery system. We have Leticia Gutierrez, who is the Government Relations and Community Outreach Director at Air Alliance Houston, joining us now to discuss this further. Leticia Gutierrez, thank you so much for speaking with us.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for continuing to stay on top of a lot of the issues that we're currently working on.
Well, you help us to do that, so I really appreciate your time. So just to start off, so there's been this series of flaring events, incidents, kind of consistent flaring happening out of Shell Deer Park. So can you just walk us through what's going on over there and what is flaring? What does that mean when we even say that? And what's happening at this facility?
Well, unfortunately, I happen to live near TPC Group, which is actually a company, industrial facility that uses the byproduct of oil to be able to create plastics. And so a lot of times our state regulators do allow industrial facilities to flare from time to time, for a whole host of reasons, a lot of them being weather related. But at the same time, we feel that it's becoming the norm around here. And it's almost as if it's okay, but it's not okay. Their lack of preparedness is concerning us very, very much so. And despite what they say publicly that industrial flaring is not harmful, they are emitting air toxins, and the smoke itself contains dangerous soot pollution, which scientists call particulate matter 2.5. And I always ask people, you can Google particulate matter 2.5 and realize and understand that it's one of the most dangerous chemicals that we breathe in on, pretty consistent basis, especially in this region. But breathing it in constantly and for high periods of time can be detrimental even for healthy humans. Because these fine particulate matters can get into your lungs and attach themselves and get into your bloodstream, and then cause a whole host of health ailments, including cancers. And so for people who are immunocompromised, pregnant women, small children, even people with heart disease, particulate matter 2.5 is very, very dangerous. We try to stay diligent on a lot of the industrial facilities when they flare and they put out, I laugh because they put out statements such as the fence line monitoring did not indicate impact outside the facility. And I mean, it's very, again, disingenuous to think, I mean, even if you were to barbecue in your backyard, right? It's really silly to think that the smoke is going to stay in your backyard. You know, your neighbors probably even half a mile away are gonna smell it. I know I do. And if I have my window open, and I'll smell barbecue, within a probably half a mile radius. And so again, it's really silly for them to have us think that the flaring and the smoke and everything is staying within their fence line.
And that's, I mean, almost related to, a totally separate story we're not going to go too deep into, but I mean, the
Yeah.
EPA earlier this year tried to pass regulations essentially saying, what one state is doing is going to have impacts on neighboring states because air pollutants are going to move across, to act like it's isolated to your border of your state is ridiculous. So, of course, we can understand that, locally in Houston, if these are kind of issues that'll affect whole states, certainly these chemicals are going to move across neighborhoods and beyond facilities. And I just want to clarify because you mentioned TCP, I mentioned Shell Deer Park, both of which have been having flaring incidents
No,
the
yes.
last days.
Yes.
So, I mean, how common is this?
I mean, again, the reason that I'm close to TPC, I'm about a mile and a half away from it, but yes, Shell Deer Park was also deciding to flare. And if you see the pictures or the footage, I was on Fox News last night and they even showed it. I mean, the whole sky turns orange, and you can see that again, for at least a mile down the freeway. And it causes people I mean, it causes concerns. We have community that'll call us and say, "What does this mean? And what's going on?" And I mean, at the same time, as I mentioned, you know, uh, anytime any of these industrial facilities do flare, they are emitting dangerous toxins. And so, to your point, yes, we've gone up to our state legislators to, rein in these polluters and try to do better by enacting new legislation. But the sad truth is that we can't even get our state regulators to enforce the laws on the books because they have said repeatedly that they are underfunded. It's very difficult for them to be able to catch them, if you will, in the act. And so by the time we start smelling, whether it's rotten eggs or burned rubber or all the other host of smells, it's too late for us to really do anything unless, it's something like an ITC explosion, God forbid, right? Where that's days on end. Because it just takes TCQ a minute to come out and really investigate and see and test and interview community. I mean, it's a whole host of things that unfortunately play against us. And like I tell community, even this is a nonpartisan issue. I mean, we pay taxes for our state regulators to protect us. I mean, it says it in the name. And so again, when we went up to DC last year to get our state regulator, or I'm sorry, our federal regulators to make particulate matter 2.5 a little bit more, I guess, how do you say, a little bit, rein it in a little bit more. And I can't remember. I know it was at 12 cubic grams per 12 cubic grams per feet, if I'm not mistaken, to 9.
You're
And
gonna have to
really,
clarify, is that a high level or
right. Well, during the Obama administration, it was actually at 6. And so the Trump administration had moved it to I believe 13. And then we were trying to get it down to 9, which we thought was a good number, even though it should still be 6, given a lot of the research that even EPA has done themselves. And so again, unfortunately, I know that it was being overruled by the Supreme Court as well after it was enacted a few months ago, earlier in the year. And so, I mean, it's like we're being consistently just knocked down anytime that we try to not just bring attention and awareness around these issues, but also as it pertains to our federal and state regulators not being supported by even our elected representatives sometimes. And so it's really disheartening. And this is part of the reason why I always say that it's hard to get community to want to vote on these types of things, to show up because they genuinely feel that change is never going to come.
I want to go back for a second because you had mentioned the ITC explosion. And I think, I'll say, I've been a little discouraged actually in some of the reporting that I've seen come out around these flaring issues because it seems to be very kind of based around, well, there's not been an explosion, so that's great. And all that's happening is, a foul odor. And so really everything's okay and don't worry about it. And the reality is there's a lot of gray space in between those two things. And as you had mentioned, there are all of these kind of chemical hazards that, benzene can cause headaches, tremors, irregular heartbeats. These are cancer causing chemicals often. There's black carbon that can emit from some of these things. And of course, it's impossible to know exactly what's going on in these flaring incidents as you were relaying. The ability to test on the ground in the moment is really, really difficult. But there's all of these other kinds of issues that we can see around flaring. And so imagining that, well, there hasn't been an explosion, so everything's all right, is really, it's just kind of disingenuous, and it sets the bar too low, frankly, for what we're thinking about. And so I think thinking and being attentive to, yeah, what are the daily repercussions of this? And then, the exact other place you were going with, locals getting involved is, I'm really curious about what people can be doing and what they should be doing to address or to elevate these concerns. I don't know where TCP exactly falls on your list, but I was going to plug Air Alliance, your organization that you're with, just put out a list of the top industrial air polluters in the region. Deer Park was 6 on the list, and so this is not an isolated new incident of pollution coming out of these facilities. We really know these are repetitive incidents. What can these facilities do? What should they be doing to be better neighbors? And how can folks on the ground get involved to try to call for them to do better?
I mean, again, anytime that we ask industrial facilities to be good neighbors, I mean, you don't have to do just what's on the books. You can go above and beyond to make sure, double sure, that these toxic chemicals are not being spewed into community and that you're not harming community's health. We get that we have to live near them. We get that, I always say I drive a car. Yes, I have to use gas, and that's just something that, it wasn't my choice, but it's what I have to do. Right. And so having said that, I mean, we understand all of the things at the same time. It doesn't mean that they have to continue to do business the way that they are. One example that I always like to use and where community I feel understands is, for instance, Valero in Houston gets to spew hydrogen cyanide. Again, Google hydrogen cyanide. It's a very highly toxic gas. But the Valero in California does not do that. Right? Why? I mean, partly because they don't allow them, but they stopped doing it long before California told them to stop. And so, again, the same thing should apply here in Houston. The Valero here, unfortunately, not only is allowed, but they spew over the limit consistently. And so I think that that's, again, what happens here in the state. It's almost as if, our state regulators and, well, more importantly, our state legislators allow them to do and police themselves in such a way where it's kind of like, don't bother them because they're creating jobs, which, again, okay, we get and we understand. But how can you have a robust workforce when people are getting sick? And more, I don't know about you, Weston, but I've never, within the last probably 10, 15 years, it seems like at least once or twice a year, I have a family member, a friend, or someone on social media, creating a GoFundMe for someone else that's going through cancer treatments. And it's just the norm. And it's something that, I guess, for me, I mean, I'm not originally from Houston or Texas, but it's not it wasn't something that was as talked about as it is more and more each and every day. And so that is something that, we obviously know that there are cancer clusters that we are aware of now, but there are also a lot of other concerning health issues within our Hispanic community that are not being talked about. So one of the things that you can do, number one, we do have a page on our airalliancehouston.org website where you can, it goes through the list of, depending on where you live, what the protocol is. You can either call 311 if you're in the city to start to complain to the city, because the city, by the way, the city of Houston does have a pollution control unit that can also go out probably faster than TCEQ to go and investigate about what's going on. And you can use that as leverage whenever you do contact TCEQ to put in your complaint. Now, we do use these complaints as ammunition whenever we go up to the state legislator. So we do encourage community to, if you see something, if you smell something, please report it as soon as possible, because again, we use these as evidence whenever we're trying to make the case for better and a little bit more stricter air permit laws as it pertains to industrial facilities. So that's the main thing. The other thing is, I hate, yes, I mean, certainly stay in tune to Air Alliance Houston's social media, because we do put candidate questionnaires together along with other partners, including the Healthy Ports Community Coalition and SEER, the Coalition of Environmental Resiliency Committee. So again, with all of the partners and coalitions together, we put a list of questions around these types of topics for candidates to respond to, and we post those on our website and on social media, so that whenever you do go to the voting polls, you know where they stand on these issues. And then one last thing is, unfortunately, in my opinion, in my humble opinion, it's not just showing up to click and vote. It's also getting involved. If you do see a candidate that is trying to, do better and create better ways of change as it pertains to these types of environmental concerns, I say, get involved, block walk, maybe phone bank for them, in whatever capacity you can to get involved in campaigns. I do have to disclose Air Alliance Houston is a 501(c) nonprofit, and we do not support or endorse candidates. But we do encourage those that are trying to get involved in these types of issues to go and investigate and research candidates to see where they stand on the issues as they pertain, to environmental justice. So yes, I mean, I know that's pretty a long-winded answer, but there's a lot to do, and community can definitely get involved.
No, that's fantastic. And yeah, I would love to see more community. A lot of folks are already involved with Air Alliance, but it would be great to see even more getting out and helping you in your mission. You guys do great work around town. Leticia Gutierrez is the Government Relations and Community Outreach Director at Air Alliance. Thank you so much for your time, Leticia.
Thank you, Weston. Appreciate you.
Finally, we have another piece from our researcher, Jessica Shu, all about flood resilience strategies.
The Netherlands hovers at just over 17.5 million residents, roughly half that of Texas in 2023. It is perhaps most known for its fields of colorful tulips and scenic canal system. In fact, Dutch innovation also includes a plethora of specialized flood strategies, refined through hundreds of years of combating water. Nevertheless, some have begun to question whether the country might disappear into the ocean altogether within the next half-century. Hi, this is Jessica, a research assistant here at Gulfstreams. As Houston recovers from the impact of Hurricane Beryl, it's crucial to reflect on the flooding challenges communities worldwide face. Understanding how they adapt to floods exacerbated by a warming climate can guide our own efforts right here on the Gulf Coast. I'm excited to continue this series of short pieces focused on flood resilience strategies and adaptations employed by communities around the United States and the world. Today, we'll begin by moving back to the early 1950s to understand flooding history in the Netherlands. In 1953, the North Sea flood caused almost 2,000 fatalities in a record-defyingly intense storm that overwhelmed dikes in the Netherlands. A report from February 2nd, 1953, noted the devastation wrought, with the extent of the impact not seen since flooding in the early 1500s in the country. Centuries ago. This event, much like the 1900 Galveston hurricane, which we discussed on last week's episode about Houston and the Gulf Coast, and similarly caused thousands of fatalities and displaced even more, might be seen as a point of reflection for the floods that currently rack the country in the 21st century. The Netherlands has 4 central rivers, and flooding is a very real hazard for those living in nearly 2/3 of the country's overall area. Like many coastal nations, it faces the dual threat posed by sinking and subsiding ground at a rate of a few millimeters per year on average, and simultaneously rising seas. Rotterdam, the second largest city in the nation behind capital Amsterdam, sits almost completely below sea level, with dikes protecting older districts and new neighborhoods constructed on elevated ground. Some factors that contribute to continued subsidence and sea level rise include the extraction of resources such as natural gas, as well as construction on soil that is not solidly sustained during flooding events. And flooding is not only prevalent in coastal regions based on surges in ocean waters, but can also be caused by torrential rain events, especially in summer months like in July and August. So, deciding how to protect this country, its residents, and its land from the threat of floodwaters is a monumental task. Various planning scenarios have been envisioned, and each requires its own set of solutions. These scenarios include protect open, protect closed, advance, which entails reclaiming land, and accommodate, moving back or sacrificing entire regions to the ocean. In the past, entire cities have been flooded, including Norward in the southwest near Rotterdam and The Hague, perhaps the most at-risk city to sea level, with its low elevation. The Room for the River program selected nearly 40 sections of the country to flood, leaving other cities unscathed for the time being. So, throughout the past 2 decades, numerous families, some of whom own large swaths of land that they use for farming and agriculture, have been told to leave the area. It would later be flooded and sacrificed to the river. Yet, as dikes protecting local regions were slowly taken apart and water rushed in, some of these families continue to live on artificially elevated ground. Supporting these types of flood resilience efforts are existing polders and other physical structures proactively placed throughout the country's most flood-affected regions. Polders are earthen mounds created below water level, at a lower elevation than rivers, for example, to encourage gravity to drain large quantities of water towards them and prevent more widespread damaging floods for the overall area. Polders now have pumping technologies installed on them in some regions, and they're overseen by several governing bodies throughout various areas of the country. For example, the water boards date back 7 centuries and can make decisions without the national government's approval. Another ambitious project is the Delta Works Plan, first conceived of after the 1953 floods, with a goal to enhance flood protection for the Dutch people. One notable structure is the Oosterschelde storm surge wall. Built as the last part of the Delta Works Plan, Maaslandkering is an enormous structure used as a storm surge barrier, which can be opened and closed. Its construction spanned 6 years. The barrier now boasts nearly 700 feet long gates, 70 feet high, to prevent water flow. The Dutch government calls it a marvel of engineering, unique to the country it protects. When the NAP, or Normaal Amsterdam's Peil, water level is exceeded by around 3 meters at any given time, the Maasland barrier is designed to close and prevent flooding. The Netherlands strategies have also been used as models, or at least inspiration, for other countries' flood protection measures. The Mekong Delta Plan of Vietnam is supported by the Dutch government. It, for one, brings into conversation the importance of economic development within delta management, as well as the possibilities brought by new sustainable flood control measures. Another country, Bangladesh, has developed a Bangladesh Delta Plan 2100 that emphasizes adapting to increasing flooding as the climate changes, enhancing freshwater protections, and responsibly managing financial resources to put forth. Like the Mekong Delta Plan, it sets a goal of bringing the nation to, quote, upper middle income status by 2030, end quote, bolstered by a rapidly growing population and fertile lands, which have been used for agricultural purposes for centuries. Other nations, which have major deltas or flooding issues and are looking to develop plans for them, include Myanmar, Canada, and Peru. The interdependency of planning around flooding brings us back to acknowledging the global nature of issues created by rising sea levels and climate change as a whole. Back in the Netherlands, the Dutch government has started a Valuing Water initiative in 2019 to consider the future effects of flooding on the nation. It includes 5 goals recognizing water's values, reconciling these values, protecting water resources, increasing public awareness, and encouraging investment among various sectors. It also considers how populations in major cities should evacuate to higher and safer ground when floods do occur. In fact, nature-based solutions have gained ground in recent years, in terms of being adapted to fit into the Netherlands. One such implemented solution is the Hans Bosch Dunes, which began as millions of cubic meters of sand, massive in quantity, that replaced the outdated Hans Bosch and Pietermer sea dike just a decade ago. The project has motivated research on sand nourishment and habitat creation for local wildlife, as well as brought up new possibilities of human use of the area for recreational activities. The Nature-Based Infrastructure Global Resource Center, which works with various agencies to evaluate new, innovative solutions like the Hans Bosch Dunes, notes that compared to the original dike, these sand dunes will bring in 100 million more euros in tourism revenues throughout the next half-century, and are less expensive to maintain through flood events. And yet, by the end of this century, the Netherlands may be facing a meter or more of sea level rise. And the adaptations installed in the country currently will only last for about 40 years, or for about 1/3 of a meter of sea level rise. Attempts to cut back on certain farming practices that generate the most greenhouse gas emissions have met with pushback from the agricultural community and others. While there are still splits in how Dutch groups and individuals believe the fight against flooding should continue, it is becoming increasingly vital that interdisciplinary collaboration between areas of study, including architecture, policy, and biology, generate solutions for this severely flood-affected nation. Learning about flood management in the Netherlands and Europe also helps us adapt to a changing climate here on the Gulf Coast. As always, informed advocacy and local neighborhood-level actions can make a difference in the fight against increased flooding here in Houston, Harris County. Thank you for listening in.
For how to get involved around town this week, I want to highlight some upcoming opportunities that are actually happening over the next couple of weeks, but putting them on your calendar now is a good idea. Harris County and the Coalition for Environment, Equity, and Resilience, or CEER, are currently hosting a series of county-wide conversations on the county's climate justice planning initiatives. These meetings are meant to update Harris County communities on the process so far, and also to garner community feedback and to help get folks to contribute to the county's climate justice planning. And anyone is welcome to attend these events. They're holding 4 throughout, just a couple that were throughout August, and now there are 2 coming up in September. So I want to put the ones that are coming up in September on your radar. They're happening in different precincts to try to get more people to be able to attend to different locations. The next one is going to be Thursday, September 5th from 6 to 7:30 p.m. at Emancipation Park. And so that's Thursday, September 5th from 6 to 7:30 p.m. at Emancipation Park. And the final one will be on Saturday, September 7th from 10 a.m. to 12 p.m. at the Weekly Community Center over on 8440 Greenhouse Road. So that's Saturday, September 7th. You can learn more actually by going over to the Citizens Environmental Coalition and looking at their calendar of upcoming events, and you'll see these listed right up on there. And so this is a great way to get to have your voice heard by county officials who are working to really think about what resilience looks like in the coming years. Up next time on Gulf Streams, we'll be having another conversation all about the unexpected histories of the oil and gas industry along the Gulf Coast and globally. If you have questions or ideas for what you'd like featured on Gulf Streams, leave a voicemail at 713-348-4081 or email us at westonT@rice.edu. A quick reminder that you can catch up on Gulf Streams anytime through our podcast, available on all major podcast platforms. If you enjoy the show, please like and subscribe to make sure that you never miss an episode. And finally, I'd like to remind listeners that KPFT is in our summer fund drive. To support more programming, please call 713-526-KPFT. Press 1 for donations and mention Gulf Streams and you pledge to help keep our work going. This work is only possible with your generous support, so please call in to 713 526 KPFT, Extension 1, and make a pledge to keep us on the air and bringing you the most important stories about the environment and our changing climate here in Houston. Gulf Streams is a co-production of KPFT Houston and Rice's Center for Environmental Studies, with support from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation and the Rice Sustainability Institute's Eco Studio. Produced by Weston Twardowski. Co-produced by Joseph Campana. Audio engineer Rico Enriquez. Research support provided by Caroline Paulin, Alex Little, and Jessica Shue. Stay tuned for the R&R Show with Ronnie Renfro and Tom Richards here on KPFT Houston 90.1 FM, Galveston 89.5 FM, and Huntsville 89.7 FM.